From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast.
The patterns that you see on the ground are rows of trees, there's alleys for cropping in between or for grazing in between. That pattern is following the water management pattern. This seems like it's cutting in and out. Is it? It's doing fine? Okay. It's just me. Wrote a book. Acres USA published it 10 years ago or so. And if I knew it was going to win literary awards, I would have done a better job on it because I just kind of threw it out there. It's what it's not. It's not a PhD dissertation. It's not, cross-referenced and footnoted all this and that and the other thing. It's just explaining what I did and why I did it for real. We now have a couple of online courses. Acres has one, and then we've just recently put this one out. And instead of going to all these classes and learn how to do horticulture and gardening, and then even farming to a certain extent, we need to understand that we live on the planet, like planet Earth, and there are plants and animals that live on the planet, and the planet follows certain behavior patterns. It has a certain order to it, and that's called the ecology of terrestrial and aquatic systems. We need to be ecologists. If we're going to be eco-ag at all, we need to understand how nature works. So this is the ecology of restoration agriculture, and how can we use ecological principles, ideas, stuff taken from forestry and apply it on our farms instead of just, buy another bag of this or buy another tool to do that. It was intentionally, originally it's like an outline of the whole overall thesis of what we did on New Forest Farm. And the original idea was that it was going to be one book at first and then 5 others that follow up that are these little piece by piece explaining each thing. So the first segment of that follow-up was the water management, because we're following a pattern that's similar to what's called the keyline scale of permanence, which means we want to start with the things that have the longest effect, the least amount of work up front to have the longest effect. And the first one is managing your water. Because here is the weather regime. We have the least amount of control over that personally. And precipitation falls from the sky. It comes in the form of fog, comes in the form of snow. It strikes the ground. Some of it infiltrates. And when it comes down faster than it can infiltrate into the soil, some of it runs off. You may not make a stream, but if you're just walking across the ground and you hear squish, 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 there's a film of water at and slightly below the surface just gradually oozing downhill, and it's moving away. And it's taking the finest particles, clay particles, with it. Then when it hits a flat spot down lower, then it kind of puddles and lines out with clay. And so that's happening even in desert areas. Much of the topography that you see in desert regions is formed by runoff water, because it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain. All of a sudden, everything's baked. It's like pavement. Then it rains, even just a little bit, it all runs away, and you have big flash floods going down the arroyos. So it doesn't matter how much rain you get, or where you're located, or even what type of rain happens. This set of techniques will help you to manage your water, however that is, because it is the number one water nutrient. No matter what we're growing, no matter where we're growing, we can do soil tests, we can do soil biology tests, and we can show that our soils are not perfect. They're deficient in one or numerous things. But there's one thing that you cannot farm without, is water. So it's critically important. So with proper management, water management, we can turn this into that, and we can turn it into that. And with proper water management, we can now take like a dead red clay soil or an industrially over-chemically agged soil, and we can turn it into a nice dark topsoil. This photo was taken in the fields where I do annual cropping. I've done wholesale produce for 25 years, some row crops. And when I started farming 25 years ago, the soil looked like that. And it would stick to my boots and make these big, gigantic 40-pound clay boots. And then now you can still see that it's clay, a very heavy clay, and if it's wet and muddy, you will get it stuck to your boots. But I would rather farm in dark black soil instead of the red soil. There's just a lot more going on there. There's a lot more total energy to run the soil food web. And then when you include planting woody crops in the rows, which is what you saw in the aerial photograph of my farm, and have an agroforestry system where we can grow crops in the alley and trees on the edge of the fields, you can now turn the soil into what's more like a forest soil underneath, and this is coming from under these trees. These are chestnut trees, focused mostly on chestnuts and hazelnuts and pine nuts and apples, that sort of thing. Now the patterning that you saw on that very first slide that moves the water all around my farm kind of originated, the technologies originated in Germany, northern Germany, where there were some mining districts, and they had pretty much cut down all of their big, gigantic oak trees and sold the branches to the English to make warships. And so they didn't have fuel to run their machinery in the mines. And so they needed to use water power, but it was kind of flatter land. And so what they started with is they started way high up in the landscape and would catch the water and cascade it from pond to pond to pond to pond to pond using channels all along the way. And it had this beautiful side effect of also passively irrigating, soak irrigating all of the farmland between the upper parts of the valley and all the way down the bottom. And it became one of the more productive regions in Germany. And you can look it up, just look that up if you want to check out some of the history of this. And the principle was to collect the water in ditches that were running almost parallel to the contour, slightly off a contour, and then divert it to the mining areas. They started up high in the landscape, like I said, and several power wheels, water wheels, were arranged one after the other like a cascade so they can go over as many wheels as possible so they could do some work over here with this water wheel, and then it goes downhill a little further, and they do some more work over there. It did all the different work. A lot of air pumps to pump air down into the mines, a lot of water pumps to get water out of the mines, all the machinery associated with breaking up chunks of rock and all that. So what it ended up being, if you guys are familiar with the Grand Coulee Dam and Lake Mead and stuff like that out in the west, somehow Americans, we got this idea that, oh yeah, you put the pond down at the bottom here because that's where all the water is. Instead of like with the German technology eventually went to England, because then England needed the mining technology that they got from the Germans, and so they developed their own mining industry based on similar principles. Well, then they kind of started this little penal colony down in the South Pacific called Australia, and eventually set up universities in Australia to train people in mining engineering. And so these techniques were taught to Australian mining engineers at the university level. That's kind of what it looks like over in Germany right now in this particular region. The buildings are all down on the lower part, but all these little ponds are all interconnected. And where you see these lines and channels, these are all irrigation channels to irrigate the cropland in between. So in Australia, 1950s, this gentleman, P.A. Yeomans, I think his first name was Percival, and I don't remember what his middle name was, but he just went by P.A. He wrote this big book called Water for Every Farm. How many of you guys have heard of this book? All right. So it's like most of you. How many of you guys have read this book? Okay, and how many of you guys have made it all the way through this book? He says he's made it through the book. You were there yesterday, too. It claims to be the first book written in English that deals with this topic, comprehensive water management on a farm and ranch property. But even the New Zealanders here, if you ask the New Zealanders here, the Australians don't speak English. You try reading this thing, it's virtually incomprehensible. And what it did reveal, though, is there's some points that really made it through. There's all this stuff that's like gobbledygook, and then there's some things that are really precious when it comes to managing water. And one is just the shape of landscapes. If everybody takes a hand, they have their own instructional video right with you. The line between your index finger knuckle and your pinky finger knuckle is the main ridge. On the main ridge, there are hills and saddles, high points and low points. You put two main ridge complexes together, and you'll end up with a main valley between the two of them. Just kind of march through that. Coming off your knuckles, this is a primary ridge, And in the crack between your fingers, that's a primary valley. Now, what's interesting about this is where it starts to get weird, because you got to understand, back in the 1950s, there really wasn't any like cell phone communication or telephone between the continents and all that, and it would take months to have information and knowledge exchanged between countries across the ocean, especially when you put a continent way the heck down there, or way up there, however you want to look at it. And so from this point on, Yeomans develops a language that he didn't realize it, but it was in isolation from the rest of the world. The rest of the world, the scientific community, geology, hydrogeologists, hydrologists, were all learning that what he was talking about here as a primary valley is a first-order stream. It's the Strehler-Horton stream order classification system. So if you have a stream, it's only seasonal, where water starts to flow in a channel. Most of us will have those. And if you have, or you participate in USDA programs, that's what you put your grassy waterways, your grassed waterways, is in the primary valleys. Well, the rest of the world calls that a first-order stream. Well, then if you take a first-order stream and it joins another first-order stream, you now have a second-order stream. So that's two first-order streams, a second-order stream. If you put two second-order streams together, that becomes a third-order stream. You can add firsts to it and second to it, so it doesn't get any bigger. But a first and a first makes a second, and then it doesn't turn into a third until you add another second to it. And that's a whole system of describing waterways. Australia happens to be geologically the simplest landform on the planet. It has no streams that are more complicated than a third-order stream. So you've got the knuckles are between the fingers, first-order stream. This main valley is a second-order stream. And then there's, I think, only 3 that turn into a third-order stream in Australia. Whereas the United States, believe it or not, has the most complex river system on the face of the planet. It's not necessarily the largest, but stream order-wise, it's the most complex, and that's the Mississippi River Basin. It's a 10th or an 11th order stream, that this stream joins this one, these 2 join that, these 3 join that, these 4 join that. And so what ended up happening is most people in the States, when they grab this book right here and they try to follow the instructions in it on how to lay out a water management system, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not that this is wrong. It's that, 1, it's incomprehensible, and 2, it doesn't apply to our complex landforms. Notice also, when you put your hands together, if you had water running between your knuckles, how it's curving back and forth. The curvature of rivers is in part because of the nature of how water flows, and it's also in part because that's what the shape of the land is when it kind of meets together. Now, it doesn't matter if you call yourself, you live a flat land farmer. That's not flat. It's just very shallow hills and valleys. It's the same handscape, the same landscape. This is a deeper, steeper one. You have really deep and steep ones and really flat, shallow ones. There is no such thing as flat land unless you've laser leveled it, and even that's not flat. There's irregularities, and water will move. It'll go to the lowest point and move. And it takes with it soil. So, right there where your primary valley between your fingers bumps into this fleshy web up top, this is a term that actually did get accepted within the scientific community worldwide, because no one ever thought of calling that place anything, and he called it a key point. And what you'll notice on my hand anyways, or up on the screen, is this key point is higher in elevation than this one, which is higher in elevation than that one. And this saddle between my knuckles is higher than that saddle, which is higher than that saddle. And when you're dealing with water and the earth, gravity has everything to do with everything. That means if we use these points, saddles or key points, to design our water management system, we can actually set up a cascading system so that rain falls on this property, and instead of all the water concentrating in the valley and flowing away, it comes down, it gets captured in a pond, it moves through these channels, it goes wherever we want to take it, and it can cascade back and forth and back and forth and back and forth all the way across the landscape. So you now evenly distribute the water across your farm. If you got a 40-acre property with a valley in the middle, and you get a 1-inch rain, the ridges don't get a 1-inch rain. That 1 inch comes down. Some of it soaks in, but some of it runs off. The valley gets way more than 1-inch rain. It might get 40 inches of rain because all the water ran off the ridges and goes down to the valley and fills up the valley. So the wet spots down in your low spots, the reason why they're wet is because you let the water go there from the high spots. So all you do is you rearrange your farming pattern to capture that water and redistribute it evenly. And you'll oftentimes dry off wet spots. And then you'll moisten dry spots, which is kind of the point. So where are the key points in this landform? This is a mountain in California that Darren Doherty, a keyline designer from Australia, uses in his book on Regrarian's Handbook. I grabbed it because he says there's only one true way to do a keyline design on this particular landform, and it's not true. Even following Yeoman's own directions, there's a zillion ways to do it. But let's start with the key points. These are all key points. They're like here, where you're no longer cracked between your fingers, it runs into that fleshy web. Those are key points of a secondary valley. And you notice how this Y shape, and right there is a great spot to design from. And notice how that one's even wetter. All that water is concentrated there. It's a great spot to design from. These are deposition points where this water started to move, and then sediment has deposited. Up at the top of deposition points, we can also use that as a good water distribution point. Now, this is how the Regrarian's Handbook says is the one true way to do a keyline design, is you find the one true key point, which we've already determined there's a number of those, and you build a dam there. How big of a dam do you build? How big of a pond do you make? You do calculations and you figure out what's the catchment area above that spot. Every key point will have enough clay to line a pond, period. That's true. How big the pond is, however, depends on how much water you can catch from the catchment area above it and how much clay is actually at that key point. So you have to actually know real stuff. You can't just go out there and wing it or turn a bulldozer guy loose and say, yeah, dig me a pond. And he digs a huge crater that never fills because you couldn't catch enough water. Or it soaks in because you didn't have enough clay. So it's a kind of a function between how much water will run off into that spot and how much clay do you have there to make sure that it doesn't leak. Now you make some channels. I don't care what you call these. In the Yeoman's book, they're called diversion drains, irrigation drains, various different terms. Most permaculturists will call them swales, which is like an excavated channel with a mound. I don't care what you call it. It's a channel, and when you dig a channel in the ground, you got to put the dirt somewhere, so you might as well turn it downhill so you have a combination ditch and mound. And then any rain that would fall up here, this ordinarily would miss that valley. Now you pick it up and you direct it to your pond. My favorite tool is a bulldozer with a six-way blade. Six-way blade means it goes up, down, tilt, tilt, back, back. And you just kind of cut it as if you're plowing a furrow with a one-bottom plow. And you turn that soil downhill. There's all different kinds of ways to do these channels that we don't have time to get into today, but I think you can figure out how to make a ditch, and you got to put the dirt somewhere, so put it on the downhill side. That works pretty good. What's interesting, so they're called swales and diversion drains and irrigation drains. USDA calls them terraces. So why don't we just call them terraces? Army Corps of Engineers calls them terraces. Why don't we use a common language that at least when we're describing what we're doing to somebody, we can, call it swales and berms to our friends or whatever. But let's call them terraces to USDA and Army Corps of Engineers because they have plan books. And actually, if you guys want, I have all the different codes that describe how to do this officially according to U.S.A. code. Because if you're going to do this, you're going to get, people are going to look and say, what on earth are you doing? And you just kind of slide the USDA technical manual across to them and say, oh, we're doing this. And let them try to figure it out. What the hell is a backcut slope width ratio? This is civil engineering that we don't necessarily have to do that level of detail, but we have plan books that will tell us how to do this, and it's free. Basically, we need to know the catchment area. How many acres do you have above this particular spot? The rainfall. Well, then there'll be a certain amount of infiltration, certain amount of evaporation, and that's what you got to design with. USDA uses a term, what they call the design storm event. And it's like a 25-year storm event. That is what they use to calculate the sizes of channels and ponds and all that sort of thing. If you want to capture, if you design for a 25-year storm event, and you get a 25-year storm event, all you do is you fill the system full of water. Well, then if you have ponds that don't leak, every time it rains a little bit, now it'll move out along these channels, and you'll have passive irrigation, a pulsed flow, passive irrigation every time it rains. If you design it to take the 100-year storm event, and it never has the storm event, you'll never fill your ponds, and you won't get that passive irrigation effect. So now we've using this landform, using the Darren Doherty style, we're going to fill that pond. Now we're going to dig an irrigation drain. Colorado, New Mexico, they call it like the ditch, the head ditch up headlands up at the top. It is perfectly level. Or you can put an irrigation pipe down, gated pipe. Then you can scratch little furrows going downhill to direct water. This is commonly how it's done in the western states, is they scratch with a marker bar or Mormon plow or whatever they call it, and then they use a gated pipe, or they'll use tarps to cause the ditch to flood, overflow. These are little holes, little gates that you can open up in the pipe. That's a marker bar scratching these lines. And so, like in Colorado, which is where this is taken, this is up at the top of the field, and the widths of these marker shoes or shanks or whatever they call them are far enough apart, so as the water moves down those channels, it will wick through the soil in between and irrigate the plants that way. And it's classic flood irrigation. You can use a middle buster this way to scratch those lines if you want. So now we've got our irrigation drain, our irrigation pipe up at the top of the fields. So what with like this classic keyline approach is they're trying to capture 3 irrigations worth of water, so you can irrigate once a month on your fields if it doesn't rain. What you could do, and what the Australians do before they irrigate, is they'll take a subsoiler or a yeoman's plow and now go crosswise and then flood irrigate that way. That way, every time that water goes there, it doesn't just run down channels and runs away. It goes in and it hits this crack in the ground and it sinks right down. And you get a deep irrigation with that water. It's a much more efficient use of flood irrigation. Well, it's interesting. It's a great way to irrigate these lowland fields with water gathered from this area. It's a larger catchment area. It's simple for simple landforms, but it doesn't irrigate the uplands. It does nothing. Up above this line here, it does not get irrigated at all. It doesn't address the erosion. You can see erosion happening there, up there. And it doesn't address cropping patterns. If you've got all this land, why not use that too? And the water that you collected from up here and stored down there, why didn't you store it up there so you can use it up there? One of the things that the P.A. Yeoman's book also shows is what they call a keyline cultivation pattern. And usually I have a swimming pool noodle. Who has a, nobody does, a swimming pool noodle, right? If you find a key point, this is a key point in the landscape, and then you make a contour line, this black line, from the key point out until the valley starts to open up. You just go that far. That's now a reference line. If you do all of your cultivation or your field patterns, mowing, etc., parallel to that key line and down when you're in the valleys, those subsequent lines now will pitch this way, so any water striking the land will automatically migrate towards the ridge. It's pretty cool if it works. And in most landforms in the U.S.A., it doesn't work because we have more convoluted landscapes. We don't have these just simple little bowl valleys that allow you to do it well. Well, after you've done the key line, you've done parallels in the valley going down, you go to the lowest practical ridge form and make a contour line around the ridge, and then you go up from that ridge reference line. And then as you go parallel up from that ridge reference line, all the lines will pitch towards the ridge. So when you combine the two, you'll have water strikes the landscape, and it migrates from the valleys to the ridges, just because of this beautiful geometry that P.A. Yeomans and folks like Darren Doherty say works everywhere. It doesn't work everywhere. We have not found a single place in the United States where both of these patterns will line up and work together. Then they say, well, just adjust, it'll be fine. It's like, but they don't tell you how to adjust it. So my book's all about it, telling you how to adjust it. So if we were to take that same landform and then just apply the keyline cultivation pattern to it, that's what it would look like. Now, if you can imagine you're doing some kind of row crops, and you're plowing in fields that swoop like this, even if you're using a horse or a donkey, if you've got these fields that are swooping like ocean waves, it's a pain in the donkey, and it's a real nuisance to use. It's impractical. Plus, the geometry of this pattern doesn't work on most landforms. Doesn't. So the system that I developed, I started on my farm, literally with the yellow yeoman's book, Water for Any Farm, and I went page by page by page, and I started at every key point where I was supposed to start with, and the doggone pattern didn't work, and so I had to figure out how to adjust. So this has been 25 years of figuring out how to adjust it. Maybe it only took me like 5 years really to figure out how to adjust it, and then I started helping other people set up systems, and I've been designing water management systems now for 15 plus years or so, based on what we call a master line system, because we'll find one line, and there is one line, there's a sweet spot on your property that if we just make this line and stick with it and use that as the pattern that we pattern the rest of the system from, it'll change the hydrology for the better. And the trick is finding that master line. Where is that master line? It is on every single landform, and finding it sometimes the tricky part. So let's use the same key point that the agrarians would use, but we're going to do it differently. For one, I live in Wisconsin, and if I make a dam across a waterway and elevate water above grade, they call that a pond. And the pond requires me to get the engineering to pay for it, to now register it with my county as a pond, and then it has to be fenced off so people can't get in and kids can't find frogs in the joy of dragonflies. They can't sneak in and go fishing at night. And then I have to insure it because somebody's going to drown and die or spill coffee in their lap or some kind of nonsense. So I dig holes in the ground. And lo and behold, the holes in the ground are not ponds. They're just holes in the ground. And coincidentally, they fill up with water when it rains. That's pretty cool. And then I make channels that go out from that. Spreader swales. They kind of spread the water out. Notice, though, that this channel crossed a primary valley. Now, if you make a line across your handscape like this, and you look through your knuckles, you see air. Well, that means is that water would have started to move in this direction, goes down that little primary valley, and then goes down the valley. So what we would do at every primary valley crossing, we make what we'd call a drive-through pond, where we take the material up above it, we scoop it out, and then we fill in the primary valley below it. You scoop this and put it there. You scoop this and you put it there. So what ends up happening is now as the water's moving down that master line, it goes in, it hits the primary valley, it fills up the drive-through pond, and then it goes on. And the reason why we call it a drive-through pond is that we make it easy egress and excess, easy to drive into and out of when it's dry, because they're shallow, they'll soak in and they'll evaporate, so you can easily drive right through it. And there's a picture of this one landform here with a couple different drive-through ponds. And you see how this one has two lobes to it? That shows us that there was a very subtle valley, one here, and then they joined right down there. And those will dry off pretty quickly, and then you can just drive right through them. Now we make level sills. There's all different ways to make what's called a level sill. And it's kind of self-explanatory. It's level, and it's like a windowsill. And when the water fills up behind it, then it now hits that level, and then it sheets off, and it'll irrigate the ground below it. So when we're designing these, USDA calls them surface discharge. So we make surface discharges. We have to calculate how much volume of water will be coming through on a design storm event, and then that means how long does that level sill have to be in order to make the discharge water 3 inches or less when it gets discharged across that ridge. It's simple math, but it's more than I want to get into right here because it'll wake up the people who've fallen asleep. So right here, this is a ridge form. It's the highest ridge on my property, and this is triangle shaped. This is an alley, there's a swale, there's a berm, there's a row of trees, an alley, swale, berm, trees, and the pattern repeats itself all the way across it. And the water from these 3 different plots all concentrates right here at the ridge, and then it sheets across there and it flows across the ridge. So where formerly the bottoms of the valleys were the wettest spot on the property, now the ridges are the wettest spots on the property. And it seems counterintuitive because people say, well, you can't make water flow uphill. And that's true. We're not making water flow uphill. Of course, my cough drops disappeared. One thing I want to show you, though, this is really fascinating. This is 4 beds of asparagus. Got 2 acres of asparagus in here. Notice how there's a gap in the asparagus right there. Why isn't there any asparagus on that part of the ridge? Just take a guess. It got drowned out. It got root rot, and it just all fell apart because that's where the water keeps cascading. So instead of saying, oh, let's drain it because it's too wet, well, no, let's think about this. Let's turn this into a pond over here. Let's do something with that water that might be more useful. Are you flipping me the bird or just waving? Yes.
So in that example, with your tilled ground draining into it and some erosion, that does not get soil depositing in your pond area over time.
This right here, the USDA calls them WASCOBs, water and sediment control basins. Before every level sill discharge, we'll have a sediment basin. And that's designed to be scooped up, cleaned out, and redistributed at some point in time. I've never scooped that out. I have a fairly long rotation period. It'll be like 4 years before I ever get back here with a tilled crop because of the cover crops that I go into. So it's reduced for me, but for somebody, if they're doing tilled crops all the time, you'll have these sediment basins and you'll want to clean them out more often. The channels themselves that move the water, you want to make sure that no trees start growing in there. You want to keep them mowed when you can. That's why we design them with that bulldozer, so you can just go ahead and you drop. The critical piece of equipment that we use for design purposes is a offset pull-behind hay bind, because you don't want to have the ridge go into that channel, so you high center and put your cutting part right through the dirt, and so you'd be able to maintain that whole channel. Otherwise, it's going to clog, catch debris, catch more silt, fill up, and then no longer function. Actually, as a matter of fact, though, this exact place right here is this. There was originally a channel there, but as because it's the top of a ridge, and as I was tilling, eventually the channel filled in, but the whole entire field is pitched that way. And so as it started to fill in, it's like, I don't really care. It's not really bothering anything. So now I have the whole entire field is like a terrace that points to that discharge spot. And the only place where I really can't get any crops established are right there where the water happens. So from here to here, it totally fills with water, and it spills off over that way. There's a million ways to do it. You could also have the level sill on the side and discharge that way if you want. You can have hot dog shaped, narrow level sills, big ponds, all different things you can do with that water. The point is, though, we know how much water was in our catchment area, how much infiltrates, how much evaporates, how much runs off, how much fills the channel, how much fills the pond, how much is left over to cascade across a level area, and we just have to figure out what those numbers are. And so then what we do is we generally strive to make parallel systems at every single subsequent channel, down and up, is parallel to that master line. What happens is that they oftentimes are not pitched in the same direction. And so if you want the water to go always in the same direction, you now adjust the bottom of the channel so it's deeper in the direction that you want to go. And the depths are minuscule. We usually work with a 1% slope as kind of like our go-to number, which means a 1-foot drop over 100 feet. And so if this is 100 feet long, it would only be 1 foot of a drop over there. Well, then if we want to move the water this way, all we got to do is drop it just a little bit more than 1 foot, and then it would all shift this way. So we can change the direction of the water year by year just by adjusting the bottom of that channel. Does that make sense? Then we make our drive-throughs at every primary valley crossing. And we adjust the depth of the swale to make the water parallels flow where we want, if you want to. Or if you don't care which way first of all, that master line, that's reestablishing the changed hydrology, redistributing the water. Then if you don't adjust the bottoms of the swales, it'll kind of start going back and forth. But the whole point here is that we want to have more residence time in the landscape so we get deep soaking of that water into the subsoil and into groundwater. Then we'll go ahead and we'll excavate a saddle pond up top. Sometimes we'll actually start up at the saddle instead of starting at the key point, but because the Agrarian's Handbook started here, I wanted to start there just to show you that the same landform can be done differently. But if you go to somebody's farm, say you don't know me from Boo, or you're the neighbor who comes over to this farm, I say, oh yeah, we're going to put a pond way up there. And you go, you can't put a pond up there, just, all the water's down here. It's like, well, that's because it came from up there, but you can't put a pond up there. It's like, yeah, there is, because we're gonna fill it from those hills. That pond is only as big as the amount of water that we can catch and fill it with, and how much clay we have available at that saddle. So to start up high, just think about the advantages now. Like in Germany, for using their mining operations, they're doing industry all along the way as that water moves through the system. If you want, you can put paddle wheels on your channels and have paddle wheels going everywhere. There was some plainclothes folks in Maine who started doing this with paddle wheels. It makes a lot of sense. When you got a big rain and water's moving, let's use that energy somehow. That pattern, what's neat about it, automatically will show us places to put buildings, put our utilities, irrigation, or livestock pipe. And now we've got these little ponds all the way through the system. If we're going to be grazing on it, now the cattle or whoever's grazing out there has watering stations. I left my pigs alone for the longest time ever this fall. It was a month and a half that I was never on the farm at all. And the pigs were just fine, absolutely fine, because they have a full, complete ecosystem that I've planted with, fruits and nuts and berries that they eat, and they're grazing grass, and they had water everywhere. And I was worried, it's like, oh, are they going to forget me or hate me or something like that? And I get out of the car and I gave them a whistle, and here comes running at me, all happy as can be. It was really cool. I like pigs. I have two for brothers, but that's a different story.
Hi there, just wanted to interrupt this episode to make sure that you have heard about our Acres 2024 Eco-Ag Conference. This year's event will be held in Madison, Wisconsin from December 2nd through December 5th. I think we have put together one of the best lineups for a conference in the regenerative and organic agriculture space. Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, and their team from Understanding Ag, along with Joel Salatin, John Kemp, Gary Zimmer, Mark Shepard, Dr. Nasha Winters, Megan Neubauer, Matt Powers, Nigel Palmer, Will Harris, Jeff Poppin, Aaron Silva, Austin Unruh, Andre Liu, Jay Fuhrer, Steve Diver, and many more. So if you're interested, feel free to give us a call at 970-392-4464 or email us at support@acresusa.com. You can also register online at acresusa.com/eco-ag.
It shows us the shortest distance to put an electrical main for either pumping or fence energizing. And if you think about that, you'll run this one main up here, and if we're going to be grazing here and having temporary fence, we can just hook onto the main right there conveniently. We may end up with situations where we have the swales intersect with already existing infrastructure like roads or driveways. We'll make specific crossings so you can cross over the terrace. It's just a wider spot and much wider this way. And one of the critical pieces of equipment is a Volkswagen Jetta that has about 1-inch clearance from the ground, or a 1-ton pickup truck with dualies and a livestock trailer. As you go down into it and then up, you don't want to pinch it or high center the trailer or whatever the situation is. So we'll put geotextile under that, and then 3 to 6 inches of gravel and rocks on top. But you want to make sure that your geotextile goes far enough so that your truck is still on the geotextile with the trailer in the bottom of that terrace. So if you think about how big a 1-ton truck with a livestock trailer is, that would be how long it would be on the way in, how long on the way it is on the way out, and it still conveys water because the low spot is right at the bottom of the conveyance channel. So that's how you cross over the swales. Now the Australians say that, well, the way to do this when you're doing keyline design, the ridges are drier. So have your roads going down the ridges because they're drier. Well, before I did this, the ridges were drier. Once you do this, now the ridges aren't the dry spots anymore. The ridges ended up being the wet spots because that's where we sent the water to. The valleys end up drying out, and there's a further complication than at my property It's kind of like, it looks like hill country, but it's not. It's actually valley country. It's like the Grand Canyon of the upper Midwest, is that all these valleys are eroded. So to go off the ridge, I'll drive off this way and then go, and fall off the end of the cliff. And so I go up and down the valley, and each one of these lines that you see is a swale. And so I'll go on either side of the pond. I'll have my crossings. So I'll cross there, and I can go into every system, every different alley. These are key point ponds, at the valleys. These aren't excavated yet, but I know where they go. And they end up being like the roundabouts, whatever you call that, rotaries. You go into it and go around it and enter in any alley from there. Now we partner that. The water distribution channels are now the pattern that we follow, and we'll plant a row of trees immediately next to, adjacent, on, or in the water management terrace. Now, if you have a channel and a mound on the slope, it actually has an effect when rain falls. The bottom of the channel will be wetter for a longer period of time because that's where the water goes. The top of the mound will be drier because it's elevated above ground level. The upslope will be kind of an intermediary. Then the downslope will have a sub-irrigation that's going down to the roots of the trees. So if you're in a real arid environment where you don't get a lot of rain, you might want to do tree planting right in the bottom of that channel because it's concentrating the water there. The example I use over and over again was an almond grower in California where we made 10 meters, but 10 meters on either direction, making a V channel to the bottom, and we planted almond trees right down on the bottom. So we took 3 inches of native rain and turned it into 30 inches of native rain just by forming that channel. So ordinarily, everybody's irrigated out there. They don't have to irrigate because the shape of the land catches the water. There's a place in Gimli, Manitoba. It was the flattest farm I ever saw. Over a mile and a half, it only dropped 15 inches flat, and it was blue clay all the way down. It's right next to Lake Manitoba. And if you dig a hole in the ground anywhere on the farm, scoop up the clay, there's water because that's the lake level, 6 miles away because it's so flat. It's the prairie provinces. So we made swales and berms, and we planted trees on the berm because it was the only dry space where you could get a tree to grow. In Vermont, where the soil is grapefruit-sized boulders 18 inches deep until you hit bedrock, we planted above the swales because when the water would catch in the swales, you'd have these jets, hydraulic hoses, blasting water out through the rocks underneath. And if you had trees there, it would just kind of blow them out of the ground. And then in most cases, we'll put them just down slope from the berm, so when the water is in the swale, it moves that direction, but some of it also soaks in, and you get sub-irrigation for the trees. So there's no one right answer to anything here. What we do has a real effect, and we need to be able to think clearly about what we just did, how that affects the land, the soil, and the trees that we plant. And then we use a subsoiler. Of course, the Australians say that you have to use a keyline plow, which is the one true subsoiler. It has a different shaped shoe on the bottom of it. And what you'll notice is they are designing and installing relatively few keyline design systems, and they're selling a lot of equipment. People have this fascination with sparkly things. I'll go talk to this person about all this stuff and learn all these incredible things and do nothing, but I'll buy a bag of goat turds that have been rolled in chocolate powder because it's the best fertility amendment we ever done because I know I checked it with my Cancer and Uranus and all that, whatever. People will buy stuff. People will buy stuff. And so they're selling, instead of just using a typical American subsoiler, small timers, all you need is this. It's a King Cutter single shank subsoiler, $250 at Tractor Supply. The only thing is that the shank is cheap steel, weld a piece of 1-inch steel pipe to the back to reinforce it, and then all you have to do is, ratchet strap a 55-gallon drum to the top of it and have a garden hose go in and you can drip in your compost tea. It's that simple and easy. You don't have to buy an $8,500 yeoman's plow. That's my yeoman's plow. It has a long story and it involves Gary Zimmer in it twice, and so it's hysterical. And I bought that, or actually I bought that the year that Gary Zimmer was talking so fast and bouncing all over the place that he fell off the stage. and then I bought it back. I sold it to him, and then I bought it back from him and all that. There's a yeoman's plow. You can go check it out. A single shank of a yeoman's plow, I think, costs you $2,500. But it's designed, you see how the bottom is almost flat? It makes a much neater cut. All it does is it drops right in. It just kind of lifts a little bit and shatters the soil on either side. So the water will go right down in the slot, and it'll ooze out into the soil on either side of the slot quite readily. When I first bought the yeoman's plow, I brought it back to the farm. They say you need 25 horsepower per shank in order to pull one. I have a 40 horsepower tractor. Okay, well, it probably won't pull the yeoman's plow. So I take it off the trailer, put it in the ground. It was like it's the biggest brake hook I ever dropped, and I can't pull it. So that's when I sold it to Gary. Then 5 years later, I'm doing a lot of installation jobs, and other farmers might want to use it. So I buy it back from Gary because he didn't really use it. Taking it off my trailer, it's on the tractor. It's like, well, let's see if I can pull it now. So 5 years later, I drop it in and I can pull it. Well, why could I pull it when the tractor is 5 years older when I couldn't pull it 5 years earlier? Because I've been using one of those things for 15 years up to that point, and the soil had become softer and softer and softer, more crumbly, until now I can pull a two-shank yeoman's plow with a 40-horse tractor that sprays diesel fuel all over the place and barely breathes. It's a sad tractor. I've used it hard. And that's what it would look like afterwards. We got this simple pattern, alley cropping pattern. Our crop alley, swale, the berm, and there's trees planted below that swale. And they're all tilted ever so slightly to come out to the ridge. And I took these pictures in that same spot on purpose, just so you can see what the same place looks like over and over again. It's not really all that difficult to understand. And that's that spot where whatever you said is, how do I keep that from getting filled with sediment? Well, it is, slowly, gradually. But now that I've done these subsoiler channels, every time it rains, or in this case right here, this is snow melt in the springtime, these cracks also fill full of water. So all the water is coming down into the soil and oozing its way this way on the surface and below the surface. And then we spill it off that way. Well, let's use the same landform, and instead of designing it from here, Australian style, instead of doing the keyline cultivation pattern, or instead of doing the classic master line system, why don't we just design a system that's referenced from this ridge over here? So we start with a contour line at the ridge, and then we excavate the master line at our chosen angle, which is 1% or less. Make our parallels up and down. Every time we cross a primary valley, let's make our little drive-through ponds. And here, because we have created the lowest spot on the ridge, let's have this series of cascading level sills on the ridge that all come down here. And now what we've effectively done is we've captured the water from this whole entire hill, shifted it over to water this ridge. Everything else gets passively irrigated along the way, and it cascades into here and fills a large pond. Is the guy from Nashville, Tennessee, who was at my workshop yesterday, is he in this room? I don't see him. There's a place, it's only like 11 and 12 miles west of Nashville, Franklin. You go through Franklin and continue going west. It's called the Inn at South Hall. They wanted a 7-acre pond in the bottom of this valley, and their restaurant, bar, and grill would take fish from here, and then the woody system, all the beef and the pork and all the fruit and nuts would come from that farm system. They serve it in the restaurant, and they wanted to have fish. So they want with a 7-acre pond, we figured out it would produce about this much fish. They'd be able to keep their menu stocked, with fish all throughout the season. But then we discovered that if we made the 7-acre pond, there's not enough water to fill it and keep it full because the evaporation and the infiltration was so great. So we took the entire hill behind their lodge and just did this to it. And these now were done in such a way that these acted as access roads, which they've now made like into tourist pedestrian paths. And they've dotted little cabins off through the woods. So, people can either drive to their cabin where they stay, and then they go eat at the restaurant that has fish that grew in the pond. But the result was that this whole entire hillside is captured and used to fill, one gigantic pond. It's a really beautiful spot. If you're ever in the Nashville area, go check it out. So then that shows the location of the tree rows and the utilities. They actually did install a pump to recharge the system. They pump it all the way up to here, to that corner, and have a big, huge tank there, because then they use this when conditions are dry. They'll use this to run a watering system for the cattle who are grazing in the alleys in between. Then you subsoil parallel to the swales and the tree rows to get good, deep water infiltration. Is that doable? Sure, why not? Is that exactly the one true key point, key line way? No, it's a different way, but using the same techniques. Just either something that's horizontal, something that's pitched 1% in this direction or 1% in that direction. We can move water almost anywhere across that hill that we want to. Well, if we have a swale going downhill with a 1% slope, it doesn't have to be 1% slope all along its whole length. We can make it shallower, we can make it steeper, shallower, steeper, shallower, steeper, and the result of changing the slope along the way is it allows you to change. Look at the end of the arrow, boom, it used to go down there. Now because we went 1% down to level, 1% down level, it elevated the end of that line. So we can discharge water at a different location if we change back here. If you can imagine a broom, if I hold the end of the broom and I move it 1 inch, the other end of the broom moves like 3 feet because I moved it just a little bit. So that's what the net effect of this changing the slope is. And oftentimes we've used it to go around a particularly significant tree or a chunk of ledge that's sticking out of the ground. You just kind of change the bottom of the swale. So here's a channel going downhill, and then it goes around the top of the tree, just like that. Not a beautiful tree. I just did that this morning on PowerPoint. I'm proud of myself. This one's referenced from a saddle. Make our saddle pond. Let's make sure it's drained. And we can put the level sills wherever the hell you want. Where do you want to put the water? Well, just make the section level right here. Make sure it fills and it spills. Make sure that it is adequately designed so it will discharge the amount of water that you have in question. I put these, level sills at the drive-through ponds, which is the old primary valley. So if you're in a wetter area and you do get big catastrophic rain events like we do in the east nowadays, when it overflows, it goes right back into the channel where it used to be. Over here, I just decided, I'll put it on the ridges because I want to water the ridges instead of re-water the valleys. Wherever you want to put them is where you put them. You choose, you decide, you figure out what effect do you want to accomplish with moving this water across your property. There's our feeder swales to fill the saddle pond. There's where our trees go, our utilities, and now we subsoil. This, I used Will Harris's barn for this. Let's just reference if you've got a building already on the site or a parking lot and it's generating a lot of runoff. Don't go design your system based on the key point. Design it where most of the water is being captured and run off. So let's design it from that spot right there, this way. Doing. All we're doing is 1% slope, 0% slope, or 1% slope in the other direction, drive-through ponds and valley ponds, level sills. And let's just go totally random. What if you want to go I want to start a system here. I just want a pond there, period, because I want it there. All right, so the orange dot, let's start a system there. Bing, 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 bing. Same thing. This one obviously is not a parallel system because it was just done by random points. We wanted to start right there and spread the water from there. Part of what I wanted to show all these examples for was just to show you the freedom and the ability that we have to move water all around our property for increased productivity. We can actually increase the amount of usable agricultural space in the original keyline system that was designed with the big pond here in flood irrigation. All they were doing was farming down here. By designing a system like this or any of the other patterns that we showed, you just gained this much agricultural land. And if you had to buy that much land, it would cost you a fortune. So you can actually get more land available to you because wetter stuff becomes drier and the drier stuff becomes wetter. And you can now use things that were further up the hill that you never thought were usable before. So let's go to the real world. This one is in upstate New York, near the capital region. And what we see here, once upon a time, this was all forested, it's the Appalachians. And they clear-cut the forest, and then they had their farm fields. And notice the plow pattern, the use pattern is straight up and downhill. And over the couple hundred years that it had been in use, the ditches, the primary valleys, Now the water hits this agricultural soil. The organic matter has either irradiated, evaporated, dissolved, or been plowed to death. And the water was no longer penetrating, so it would erode. So all the grassy waterways began to erode more and more. And so what was their first response? It's like, oh, I've got water running in a channel here, and it's flooding out over my field. Let's dig the ditch deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And let's keep ditching this until we make a cascading, rapids, whitewater, rafting river going down through the farm and have these huge erosion gullies going across it. Well, then the farms get subdivided with all these ditches that you're doing, trying to get rid of this water, get rid of this water. And, of course, then they complain. They're on a mountainside that has basically no soil. It's just gravel. And the water soaks in, and if you don't get rain in the summertime, you're toast. But that's okay. We can pump it from down here at a cost of $85 billion a minute and pump up there and irrigate. They lost use of this whole field over here just because the soil washed away right down to the ledge, almost completely down to the ledge, and it got overgrown with multiflora rose. This whole area got covered in with silt that kept washing off the fields. So let's correct this. Quick question, because we're running out of time. Right. Right. Let's talk about this here, because I'm looking at my clock here, and I got 1 minute. So, and this is the tail end flurry. See, they're clapping and shit. So we gained them 30 acres of additional useful ground by changing. Here's the original runoff pattern. We now go in and we do this. It's a master line system. Now the water cascades through the property. There's 2 ponds that are deep enough and they're perennial. They stay around. They now have trout in them. Trout, catfish, mussels, crayfish, salamanders, and frogs. Why would I care about salamanders and frogs on a farm? I'm organic. They eat bugs. They're huge bug eaters. And so now we got these amphibians going like crazy. The birds are crazy. This is like a 26-foot deep pond. It's a pretty big pond. Now the water, just watch the pattern as it flows across the landscape. It goes over there, then it spills. We pick it up, we move back here. We spill it again. We pick it up, and we move it, and we move it, and we move it, and we move it. Until the whole property is this one continuous cascading system of the water that formerly would have gone zip, gone. It's now there, it's soaking in, and it's now sub-irrigating, watering the trees. And these are mostly chestnut, oaks, pecan, persimmon, and that sort of thing. And that's the last slide there. So part of what I wanted to do is to, in case you had the misfortune of reading the Yellow P.A. Yeoman's book first, if that was your situation, I want to just like blow your head apart and say, look, we have an amazing amount of freedom within these very simple rules. Make a channel that's level, the water will do one thing. Make a channel pitched this way 1%. Make the channel pitched this way 1%, and the water will do different things. Now you start combining them. If you have one channel here, and one channel here, there's 739 different options that you can do with 3 channels and 2 ridges and a valley. So open up your thinking, manage your water resources, whether you have too much or too little, move that water where you want it, store it in the ground. It's the cheapest way to store your water, and may you have a prosperous season. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Kennedy Stroessel and Weston Larson of Acres USA. And we're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.